Hey, Armen.
Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Very good. So this is our fourth episode, right?
It's never good in math, but I think it is. Yeah,
Never good at math. That's why you went into history.
exactly. Just never could cut it in geometry or calculus or anything else.
Just read books instead of calculate numbers.
Yeah, a lot easier.
I don't know. Retaining all that information takes some serious brain power. I don't know. I wasn't very good at math either. All right, we're going off, getting sidetracked. The first thing I want to do is get out of the way. We've got 33 weeks left until what event, Armen?
The 100th anniversary of the trial?
Nope.
Gosh, of the actual assassination.
Correct. And what was the date?
June 3rd, 1921.
That's the trial.
Oh, March 15th, 1921.
The historian. Okay, fair enough. Those are two. It's 33 weeks until the assassination and 44 weeks until the trial. All right, let's move on. Real quick, I just want to go over what we're going to talk about today. You've got something that you emailed me and made a suggestion, and I thought that was a good suggestion. So that's kind of a tease and we're going to do that last. So we're at the end of this conversation, we'll finish up with your idea. But before that, I want to real quickly. Well, first we're going to flash back to our conversation from last week. People who are watching don't know, but our conversation, well, if you watched last week's episode, there's a tease at the very end. Our conversation continued. We're going to talk about the trial. I keep bringing up this book, but this is really where this journey started for me. And we're going to talk about what was falsified, or there was false testimony given in the trial. And we talked about that last week. So in a second, we're going to flash back to that last week's conversation. Also, there's something we didn't talk about last week in the trial I want to go over that was really important for me, and then we'll get to your topic. But before all that, let's just say, if you have been enjoying this content, this conversation, please subscribe and click the notification bell, because that'll let you know when we post. We try to post every week, and then sometimes we put up some other stuff. And so if you want to watch this content, click subscribe. But more importantly than that, please share it. If you are enjoying this, if you're being enlightened or encouraged, or you think there's something controversial and you think you have friends or family or somebody that you know that might be interested or want to watch it, share it with them. So got to do that little plug every week, because I guess that's what you're supposed to do on a YouTube channel, right?
Are you waiting for me to answer that?
Maybe I'll leave that in instead of editing it out. You watch YouTube. You're supposed to put a plug, right? Are you sharing this with people, Armen?
Some people.
Oh, maybe there's people you're like, oh, I don't want them to see this. Actually, now that I think of it, before we were about to watch that, I'm about to cut to last week's conversation, but I put up a video that when you summarized the history of the Ottoman Empire leading up to the Armenian genocide, when you did that 15-minute summary. So I posted that section of that episode by itself, and it's getting some views, and we got our first thumbs down.
Yeah, I actually saw that too. It was a comment they also left, right? It was, the channel was called the Tales of Truth, but he didn't apparently find anything I was saying truthful.
Well, yes, the comment was like a bunch of lies or something like that.
Yeah, well.
Interestingly, because you're a moderator on the YouTube channel, you were able to see the comment, but I don't think I've made comments public, so you were able to see it. Yeah, that was interesting. Got our first thumbs down.
Yeah, well.
That's kind of exciting to me.
Yeah, well, maybe you'll kick up more dust and controversy while it's at it.
Yeah, we got targets on our back, right?
Yeah.
You don't like to hear that. Anybody that tries to tell the truth is inevitably going to be challenged But that's why we're doing this. If you want to challenge us, let's go. That's why I went to you as a historian, and these other historians that we've been teaming up with and going to the archives ourselves. Hey, if you want to call it lies, go and prove it. We're proving the truth, or we're proving what's most likely that occurred. All right. Enough of us bantering back and forth. Let's cut right now. I want to pick up on that conversation that we had last week, the piece that wasn't a part of last week's episode. This is where you're explaining some of the things that were in the trial that were fabrications or outright lies, and even some omissions. Let's cut to that right now.
Well, I mean, I guess the most glaring error, if you want to call it, or mistruth during the course of the trial was that Tehlirian was in the Ottoman Empire once the genocide began. And in reality, as we were talking about it last week, Tehlirian was serving in the Russian army, which was not too far away from the towns and cities where Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Anatolia. But he was not actually part of this deportation caravan that he describes, and he did not actually witness the deaths of his family members firsthand. And even when he talks about seeing his sister being murdered, he didn't even have any sisters to begin with. So a lot of this was just obfuscation, or way of him trying to tell a different story to the court in order to obtain a more sympathetic hearing from the judges and from the jurors.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a big deal. And there's a couple other little things, like they lied about his age in the trial, because if they made him a year younger than he actually was. They changed his birth date, basically, because if he were 18, which he was, if he were 18 at the time of the genocide, and if he were in the Ottoman Empire and 18, he would have been conscripted into the military, into the Ottoman military. So he wouldn't have been home to be deported and to see his family die. So they changed his birth date to 17, so that he was supposedly 17, so that he would have been there. The fact of the matter is, he wasn't there at all. He was in Serbia. And then another thing, and this is not a falsification, but one significant thing that they omitted was that he was a part of the volunteer regiments on the Russian side of the war, that he was in the military actually fighting against the Ottomans. So he was fighting against his own nation. And it's all in an attempt to make him more sympathetic to the jury, as any defense attorney will try to do. So that makes this, a real story, because if you've got a hero, your heroes, we like to idolize them and think they're perfect. But then, well, maybe they lied. Well, maybe it was his defense team that insisted. Well, he went along with it. And so in Hollywood, that's actually, for a Hollywood story, it's good, because your heroes need to be flawed. Otherwise, you don't really believe them. So that's all fascinating stuff. Next week, we'll talk about one of the things that maybe we mentioned it before in another episode, but I want to focus on one thing that he said in his testimony. As I realized some of these things weren't true, there was one thing that he said that I'm like, I hope that is true. It wasn't something they made up, because it certainly made him more sympathetic to the jury. But I felt like I will have no more respect for this guy if he actually lied about this one thing. So there's a tease for next week. All right. So that was just a hint of some of the other stuff in the trial, that there's so much in this trial, in this transcript, that is riveting and fascinating. And you and I traveled to Berlin. We went in the courthouse, right? I mean, you want to talk briefly about that experience of going, what it was like to be in the courtroom and in the courthouse? I mean, did that impact you like it impacted me?
Yeah, and I'm actually trying to remember how exactly did we find out it was that exact courthouse that the trial was held. I think I must have just done a little bit of research and uh, discovered that was where the main court district in Berlin was, at least in the 1920s, for at least in the where the assassination took place, and where the courthouse was located would have been most probably the location that they would have taken him. That was my thinking of it. And I think what I did was I tried to find some old images just to see if it corresponded with the building that we thought it was located in. And, sure enough, it was there. And also, I went and visited there before you and I and our other historian friend went and together. But going there was pretty cool because it's this building that was constructed early in the 20th century. And I think when you and I were there, the person who was taking us on a tour was telling us this was the first building in Berlin that had electricity introduced to it, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. When it was built only a few years before the trial, so it was a brand new building when this trial took place. And I think one of the ways that you determined that this was the actual courthouse is because there's actually a prison attached to it, right? And there's only like one place like that in Berlin.
I'm not sure if that's the only place that they have it, but it's this very unique architecture. There's even a word for it called the panopticon, which means that from this is what like social theorists have called it, where from one location you could basically observe all the prisoners. And so it's like this star-shaped prison where from, I think, the center, like you can see like the wheel spokes, right, of like all the holdings. So from that vantage point, you can see every part of the prison courtyard. And so a lot of reconstruction, I think, took place in the years after the trial in the early 1920s. So some of the architecture had been altered a little bit, but it was still essentially a functioning prison and attached to a courthouse when we went.
What was fascinating when we went there, we'll get into that story later, but I do want to point out that there were only two possible courtrooms. So we knew we were in the right courthouse, but there were two. There's several courtrooms, but there were two main courtrooms where the bigger trials would take place. One was room 500 and one was room 700. So they're like a couple floors below each other. And you had mentioned, I believe, that it hadn't been definitively established which of those two courtrooms the trial actually took place in. But while we were there, we were referencing that picture that you mentioned. I'll put it up here. So in this picture, you notice the architecture on you can see the arches at the top of the ceiling coming down at a certain angle. And then the wall itself, in one of the courtrooms, the wall was flat. In another one of the courtrooms, the wall was concave. So we went into both of those courtrooms and definitively determined, the architecture didn't change in 100 years, and we definitively determined that it was courtroom 700. And do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, and maybe you can, if you want to maybe edit this part out, but do you want to talk about the lady who took us around the courthouse, or is that maybe...
I'm not going to edit that out, but I do want to talk about that in a future episode. That's kind of what I was mentioning before. There's a lot of details from that trip and from this visit to the courthouse that I want to go into, but it's too much to really cover right now. I really do want to talk about that woman who gave us the tour, but that's just a tease for a future episode. But when she took us in, okay, I'll tell a little bit. This particular person was not expecting us. We just showed up out of the blue. Turns out she was a former prosecutor, a former judge, and a former, she had something media. Well, her job right now is the liaison, the courthouse liaison with the media. So if there's big, high profile cases that come into that courtroom, or into that courthouse, she's the first point of contact for all the press. And so we stumbled into the right person. She was happy to take us around. And because of all of her experience, she was able to point out and explain to us exactly how the trials took place, who was who, and who sat where in the room. And while she was there is when we determined definitively that we were in the actual courtroom. And I had this moment of, I don't know what you'd call it, just moment of awe and humility. I was like, it was stunning to me, this project I've been working on, the Tehlirian life story, that this incredible moment in his life, but this incredible moment in history. I was standing in the actual room where it happened. There's no way to really put it into words. I had that. I don't know, as a historian, maybe you're not taken in by those things, but I really was. What was your impression?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to kind of go back to the courthouse itself, just entering it inside like this cavernous structure, right? Like when you go in there, they're past the security, and there's these massive, stone stairwell which leads up to, I think it was like if there was a courtroom 700, I guess there must have been 7 stories.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it was this very massive structure, and to go in there was pretty cool. But to also go into the courthouse where the trial was held was also interesting, because I remember I was just constantly looking at my phone and the photographs that I had of the trial when they held it back in 1921, because those exist. It was just interesting to kind of compare and see that even though they may have rearranged like some of the seats and where the defendant stands or where the judges sit, I mean, there was still the exact same courtroom. And again, having that lady who was giving us the grand tour of the place was also cool, just to place everything in context. So
yeah, that was, we'll talk more about that in future episodes. I am trying to kind of go chronologically through my journey of how I came and my journey of discovery with you. But every now and then we have to flash forward, etc. But earlier in this episode, when I had mentioned when we were talking about the things that were falsified in the trial, I mentioned that next week I want to talk about this one thing. Well, I'm going to talk about it now. There was one thing in the trial that Schlichtmann testified to that I knew that he lied about certain things, but there was this one thing that I was hoping, I was like, I hope to God he's not lying about that one thing. And that is when he testified about his mother. Do you remember what he said about his mother?
I mean, from what I remember, it was like the dreams that he had been having of her, and how she essentially directs him to carry out the assassination. I mean, that's the one thing that I feel like,
yeah,
that's what you're referring to.
That's exactly it. So it went to motive. They were asking him, why? Why did you do this? And one thing, especially after reading the transcript and rereading the transcript, there's a moment where he's talking about how it was a struggle within, that he was thinking, how could I bring myself to end another person's life? It's a real struggle. And he was there for that reason. That's the only reason he was there. Yet still, down to the wire, the last couple days, he's still struggling with that idea in his mind. How can I take another person's life? Even though he had already done it a couple times, or at least one more time previously. Again, that's a tease for another episode, but in the transcript of the trial, he brings that up. But then he answers, my mother essentially said, my mother made me do it. He said, my mother's ghost appeared to me and said something to the effect of, you can't be with me in heaven until you do this. And when I first read that back almost 3 years ago now, I I was like, that has to be true. I mean, how could you make something? Some people say, of course, that's made up. Though that's a delusion, but one of the things you'd mentioned about this case is how it opens up the discussion about post-traumatic stress disorder, or some of the psychological effects of war, is how I think you phrased it when you were describing the importance of Soghomon Tehlirian. And so that can easily be chalked up to he was so traumatized by the things that he had experienced, the things that he had seen. And that's true. His life was... You and I can't possibly imagine the suffering that he was going through. All he wanted to do was see his mother again. And then he found out not only his mother, but everybody else in his community had been massacred. We can't imagine what it would be like to be in his shoes. And so it was a psychic or psychological rift.
Trigger.
Say again?
Like a psychological trigger, right? That's what
Trigger,
I would say.
Right? So his life was changed. It was a gradual process. He was at war, seeing the brutality of war, but then the realization that he would never see his mother again. He would never even know what happened to her, where her body was, how she died. It's that unknowing, that lack of closure. And then he has these visions of her. And so he testifies my first glimpse of that was in the transcript, because I didn't know the memoir. I didn't even know the memoir existed at the time. But then when he says that in the trial, I'm like, wait, I hope to God that's true. And then when I hear the memoir, and you read the memoir to me, that it's not just that one incident, it was recurring. And so that was, that's when I really knew that this story was something special, something different. I mean, there's a lot of things that make this story unique, cinematic, and important, and that was one of them. So I just wanted to cover that. So, all right. In the last thing we want to talk about in this episode, you had brought up an idea. So what was your idea?
Well, I mean, it was just reflecting on the title of our show, right? If it's called Hollywood in History, shouldn't we also be talking about Hollywood in history on like a more general level? Mm-hmm. Just obviously you can you have your pick of like so many films that have period pieces that depict events from either the era that we're looking at. We could just think of 1917 that just came out a few months ago. It's about two British soldiers during the First World War, and there's no shortage of the topics, but I thought maybe we could also just talk about, on a general level, how exactly do you even go about depicting like a particular event, whether it's fictional or it's based on somebody else's life. I feel like Hollywood over the last maybe the last half century or so, just to kind of like bracket it temporally, like sometimes it's gotten it right. I think Saving Private Ryan is one of those pieces which is not only a war epic but really immerses you into the periods. And I say that I singled that film out because I've watched some of the behind the scenes, and just listening to like Steven Spielberg talk about how he not only wanted to recreate the actors and the events from this one period during the summer of 1944 with the Allied troops landing in Normandy, but even the sights and sounds. So and the smells. I mean, it's interesting how even if the film may not necessarily be 100% accurate, it's very authentic in terms of how it tries to capture the same vocabulary that the soldiers would have used at the time, or the same kinds of sights and smells that they do it. And I think that shows much more dedication and effort than what you might see in another period piece by some other director who might just invest just very little or minimal effort into capturing that time. So I don't know. I mean, I thought maybe you might have some ideas on that, since you're a movie aficionado, aren't you?
I have a lot of ideas. I just I wanted to hear your initial thoughts, but so the title of this show, this podcast, is Hollywood in History. My intent is, yes, to talk about Hollywood and how it deals with history, but also how it gets it wrong, and how, well, actually, the name Hollywood and history, another thought is that since I'm the Hollywood guy and you're the historian, it's personified. I'm Hollywood and you're history. So it's a double connotation. I do want to talk about Hollywood in this episode. There's an unfortunate expression that goes around Hollywood: don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. I may have mentioned that last week or in a previous episode. Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Now, that strikes me. I mean, I understand the sentiment behind it because history often doesn't fit into a perfect story structure. And if you try to be, there's the idea that if you try to be accurate to history, you're just going to ruin it and it won't make money because you're going to interfere with the formula, right? There is a formula to story structure, and there are exceptions to the rule, but generally your protagonist has a journey, an arc that he or she has to go on in order for the viewer to be sucked in. The point of a movie is for you to forget you're sitting in a movie. You have to put yourselves in the shoes of the protagonist and go on the journey with them. And there is a pattern to that journey for you to come out of the theater going. The goal of every filmmaker is for the person that comes out going, oh, I got to tell so-and-so about this movie. That's it. That's the only goal of any movie. For the person to come out going, oh, I have to tell someone else because you were impacted personally and you want that person to feel that. And so don't let the truth get in the way of a good story means history is messy. Oftentimes you'll have heroic characters that have these just terrible, terrible events or things that they did that you don't really want to portray that in the movie because it'll make it difficult for you to root for that character, etc. And oftentimes there aren't happy endings. And so Hollywood will tend to modify, and unfortunately it's not a hard fast rule. Well, I shouldn't say, I think Hollywood uses that as an excuse, right? It's not that they're trying to be as close to history as possible and then changing the things that they think will ruin the story. It's more like, we don't really care what really happened. The writer or the producer or the director will say, I think this is the best way to tell this story. And if we have enough actual elements in it, we can say it's based on a true story, and that'll be part of our marketing, right? They just don't even really care about telling the truth. I think that's more often the case. But I think, now, I don't know, is Saving Private Ryan was Private Ryan? It was his brothers had passed away, and there was a law or a military law that if there's multiple siblings in war, if they all die if the other siblings die, the one living sibling has to be pulled out. That was the actual principle or law. Is that right?
I mean, maybe just to give people who haven't watched Saving Private Ryan, definitely it's one of the best military dramas, I think. And if you guys haven't watched it, I would definitely recommend it. It's not for the faint of heart. It's a rated R film, but just a brief synopsis. It's about again, takes place during the Normandy landings when American and Allied troops land in June 1944 in France. And during those landings, there's one soldier who loses 3 of his brothers in the span of just 1 week. I think it was 3 of his brothers. And one soldier, or a captain, actually an officer, is tasked with leading a squad of his close men to rescue this young man in order to bring him back home and basically he gets a free ride back home. But from what I remember, it was in 1942 when there was an American warship that sank. I think it was called the USS Sullivan. And I believe there were 3 brothers who were on the ship. I could get that wrong because, again, World War II history is not my specialty, but I remember the details where the ship sank, and I believe all of those brothers perished. And so I think the rule, at the very least, if I'm not sure if there was necessarily a rule to send that a surviving sibling back home, but at the very least, the men would be placed in different military units. So if during the battle, all the siblings are in, take part in it, if they are to die, of course, that's a massive tragedy. But the idea, I think, was to spread out men in different units, different branches, and that film, I think, took the inspiration from that one incident in 1942 and then recreated it on a very micro level. And I think
so. Was the actual Private Ryan, was that story based on an actual Private Ryan, or is it some other family? Or I'm sure that happened more than once. There were cases of this happening, but do you know if it was based on an actual person?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was. I mean, I'm sure something like that happened with siblings serving in war, and perhaps one or more of them perishing during the fighting. But there wasn't actually a Private Ryan who was a paratrooper, as is portrayed in the film by Matt Damon. And so it was just for the most part, the story is about the squad of men who, even they ask themselves, the question, what's the point of sending 8 of us to rescue one guy? And the whole idea is to recreate the landings, which are very brutal whenever the American troops land on the beaches, and more just to create that first couple of weeks in June 1944, but also to tell this very human story, and not simply to portray gratuitous violence, but really just to get at the heart of a story of this young man who earns a right to go back home, but when he's told that, I mean, he's not exactly excited to, or he doesn't jump at the opportunity, which is also, again, a striking thing, and also good storytelling, if I can compliment Mr. Spielberg about that.
Well, I actually personally highly recommend that movie to anyone who hasn't seen it because of its realism and attention to detail. So that Saving Private Ryan is a case where I think it's fairly, in the case, it's not important that it was a real person, but it's an effective narrative to draw you into draw you right into the experience of what it must have been like. I mean, as close as anybody's gonna get of what it must have been like for a soldier, the moral dilemma, the self-sacrifice of these guys that are, this struggle with what, why are we risking our lives for this one guy? And then, well, watch the movie. I highly recommend it. I think a lot of the battles and the scenarios were based on actual scenarios, whether the individuals that are your main characters were actual people or not, I don't know. But I do have an issue with that in other movies. And if movies are portraying an actual character and then they significantly change details about that character, to me, or add events that weren't there, I think Hollywood has erred on the side of making money. I mean, that's like a kind of cliche thing to say, but there is a responsibility. They would say, well, our responsibility is to our shareholders to make money, but entertainment is a powerful medium, and you affect people's belief systems. I like that movie. You mentioned 1917 that came out. That one is another one. If there are a list of movies, war movies, whether it's World War I, World War II, Civil War, Saving Private Ryan and 1917 are both up there high on a list that I would recommend. But an example of a movie that I think is a horrible example of history, or of an abuse of Hollywood's responsibility to tell the truth. is JFK.
By Oliver Stone.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go into the details, but people come out of movies like that believing a bunch of fabricated, there's a truth, there's something that really did happen, but as a historian, I would say Hollywood's not going to listen to the historian in that case because they want to make a compelling drama. When I thought about this topic, when you were saying, well, let's talk about Hollywood films and their portrayal of history or not, there was an irony. Like, Hollywood is not that interested in the truth. They're just interested in telling compelling stories. And then I remember when I was coming to visit you at your university, I don't know if, where do you go to school?
Georgetown.
All right. So we haven't mentioned that yet, but hi, everybody at Georgetown, if you're watching. So when I was coming to first visit you and actually meet some of your professors there, because of the way I tend to talk, I like to use the word truth. It's the truth. Let's find the truth. And you were like, well, why don't you be cautious about how you throw that word around? You're going to be in a room full of historians, and it's just not in our vernacular. That's just not the way we speak about truth. And I get that. Most of us use the word truth all the time in our language. But when we're talking about history, we're really talking about what most likely or most probable events. And so don't say, let's find the truth. Well, so there's that similarity with Hollywood. The word truth just isn't part of the vocabulary. What's unique about our project is the closer we get to the truth or the actual events, the more cinematic and compelling and Hollywood this story feels. It literally has the most Hollywood ending you could possibly imagine, but it actually happened. And so my hope is that we can set a trend and reverse the course. I think Hollywood should be more responsible when they're trying to portray history. There are a lot of compelling stories of things that actually happened, and not to just make things up. Probably the best example of in the past decade or so of a war movie in particular, that stuck pretty close to the facts is Hacksaw Ridge. So I did look into, what differences there were. And in the movie, it's portrayed as like happening over a day or two, the events of Hacksaw Ridge, the battle. But it was more like a week. There's a couple things that were changed, but it was pretty accurate to what actually happened. And that was a very successful film. That was a well done, high production value. It was a box office success, a critically acclaimed, and it stuck pretty close to historical events about an actual historical character.
Can I share my story about Hacksaw Ridge?
Please. And then we'll wrap up with that.
So the film actually ends with an interview of the protagonist, the main character in the film, when he's at a much older age, and he's recounting his service during the Second World War. Again, for those who haven't watched it, it's an amazing film that takes place partially in the United States during the Second World War, and then when this young man is dispatched to the Pacific to fight on the Pacific front against the Japanese as a medic. I'll just share those details. But I remember watching the film and thinking, if all the things that happen in this film, or even just half of the things happened, I would eat my hat. And I went on to Wikipedia, and exactly the way that it was shown was the way that things had happened. And I don't own any hats, but I would have gladly eaten it after eating it, after reading those, after reading all that.
Now stop right there. I feel bad. I didn't realize until I watched this that Armen just made a joke, and I didn't hear it, and I didn't laugh. So I'm sorry, Armen. That was funny. I just moved on. Good job, Armen. I don't research every film, but when I watch a film that purports to be based on historical events, I do go and try and find out, like, not just war films, but what was the one, the why is it escaping me? Oh, Bohemian Rhapsody,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So there's this is the life story of Queen, of Freddie Mercury, and so that one I enjoyed that film immensely and was familiar with some of the details. And so afterwards, there were a few things they chronologically put a few things out of order, and there were a few things that weren't totally accurate. But because the band themselves were consultants on the film, for the most part, it was historically accurate. And so Hacksaw Ridge is one that I think is probably the closest, to our story. But the Soghomon Tehlirian story, as I believe I said previously, when this film is made, it will be the most historically accurate film, and you're not going to believe it because it's just these things really happen. You don't have to embellish anything. You actually have to cut a whole bunch of stuff out. You just aren't going to believe that all these things really happened to this guy. All right. Well, it's good talking to you, Armen, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Likewise, Mike. It's good seeing you. Have a good one.
Remember, everybody, share, like, subscribe, all of that. So we'll talk to you again next week. Bye. Let's see. You have framed yourself a little differently today.
Right, because I thought I would record on my
Oh, yes. Got it.
phone.
Great. So you're going to do what I'm doing. You're going to look at your phone.
Yeah, and I'm recording it on the highest quality, which is 4K at 60 frames per second. So,
oh, great. That might be better than mine. Just kidding.